The changes that Mazda has been going through over the last handful of years has been very well documented, where they have let everyone know that they want to be an upscale brand to take on Lexus, Acura, and Infiniti at some point down the road, possibly even European rivals as well, leaving Chevrolet, Ford, Toyota, and Honda far behind. And we have seen them come out with vehicles that do feel very premium and luxurious for the price point. But one crossover that is very intriguing and is setting the tone for where Mazda is going in the near future and possibly even for years to come is the CX-50. Because from the outside you would say, okay, it's bigger, it's longer and wider, and it looks a bit more rugged than a CX-5, but from the outside it looks very similar, and I think when you check out the interior you're going to have the same reaction as well. But you're probably wondering, what is the point of this crossover? Is there going to be parity in the lineup? I think that's really a question that everyone has been asking. And finally, I'm going to try finding some answers today, as we're going to take a look at the all-new 2023 Mazda CX-50. We're going to take a deep dive into this crossover, see how it compares to the CX-5, and really see if it is a true compact crossover or if it's a completely different beast, where it's going to take on the Ford Bronco Sport, Subaru Outback Wilderness, and other rugged crossovers that can go off-road, that can have adventures, that can do more than the more civilianized crossovers like a RAV4 or CR-V. Now, before we get in this video, I want to give a huge shout and thank you to Ira Mazda of Westwood in Westwood, Massachusetts, for allowing me to do this review. But best of all, give me the keys to this crossover for the entire weekend to see how it compares and contrasts to the CX-5, but also to understand the ins and outs of this vehicle. I'll leave their link in the description below so you can check out their extensive Mazda inventory. Also, before we get started, make sure to hit the subscribe button and click the notification bell so you're notified every time a new video goes live on the channel. And so, without wasting any further time, let's get right in this review. Ever since Mazda prioritized interior comfort and giving consumers a specialized and classy experience for the market they compete in, this Japanese brand has consistently drawn positive attention. When compared to the Hondas and Toyotas of the world, that's where people were eager to point out the size of the lineup and the manufacturer's inability to compete on a larger scale. But Mazda has risen to the challenge to take on a new segment where they can flourish. The CX-50's arrival puts competitors on notice, setting the stage for what's to come in the future, as they fully intend to offer vehicles that excite, feel premium, and now take on the elements. The real question is, has Mazda crafted and engineered a unique vehicle to kickstart the 2023 model year, or have they reinvented the wheel, for a lack of a better term, by designing a crossover that looks like the CX-5. Starting off with pricing, the CX-50 Turbo Premium Plus comes in at just over $43,000, sitting at the top as the highest trim for this model. Buyers and journalists alike have pondered the existence of this crossover, not only due to its similar alphanumeric similarities with the CX-5, but also the size and exterior looks of this vehicle. While on paper, and even at first glance, the CX-50 may seem like a copy and paste, with a few exceptions for the design cues, but it's actually a quite different crossover than its sibling, as they don't share platforms, and in fact, it's closely related to the CX-30. When it comes to dimensions, the CX-50 is about 5 inches longer and 2 inches wider than the CX-5, but the real meaningful measurement that sets this rugged crossover apart is the off-road capability, with 8.3 inches of ground clearance on this model. But if you get the Meridian edition, that will increase to 8.6 inches. We all know that the CX-5 is not built to handle most terrain besides pavement, but that's where the CX-50 slots into place, and its road presence makes that very clear. Mazda has always embraced minimalism, where the front fascias are aerodynamic and sleek, but they don't scream and shout with excessive body lines or aesthetic features. The CX-50, on the other hand, takes a different approach that is needed to not only be competitive amongst rivals, but also help eliminate any indication that there's a close relation to the CX-5. Obviously, with the CX-50 being designed as an adventure crossover, plastic cladding will make its way on the lower portion of the front bumper. But a design cue we've never seen before from Mazda are the side active air vents to add some aggressiveness, but also a sportier character as well. You'll notice that the chrome accents, which are present on most trims for the CX-5, don't make an appearance up front, as the blacked out grille is far more striking and eye-catching when first seeing this vehicle in person. The CX-50 will come equipped with full LED headlights, and as we saw for the refreshed model of the CX-5, there are no fog lights, and instead, the turn signal indicators will be mounted just above the cladding. Moving over to the side profile, the Turbo Premium Plus will be sitting on 20-inch wheels, but there will be 17s found on lower trims. The cladding around the wheel arches lets you know that it's a capable crossover, so if you frequently have outdoor adventures, you'll be more inclined to choose the CX-50 over the CX-5. Suspension and ride quality have been a point of emphasis for Mazda as of late, and the CX-50 does a great job of balancing rigidity while still retaining the softness and support we expect from the brand as they move in the direction of luxury. You'll have power folding gloss black side mirrors with turn signal indicators to go along with blind spot detection for added safety. Then coming around to the back, the design language follows the same pattern as up front to make this crossover look more symmetrical. Not only does the plastic cladding continue, but there's also contrasting accents for the rear diffuser that does make it seem as though the CX-50 has skid plates both in the rear and up front. Maybe drawing some criticism by some are the fake grills, but honestly, from a cosmetic perspective, really does complete the rear fascia where it's not just your typical everyday compact crossover. As we saw up front, full LED taillights adds an upscale vibe, and while the body lines are indicative of its tougher on-road demeanor, the low roofline does provide a sense that the CX-50 is athletic as well, and that it's not just one-dimensional. Under the hood, the Mazda CX-50 in this review is powered by a 2.5-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder engine that produces 256 horsepower and 320 pound-feet of torque on premium fuel, and is paired with a 6-speed automatic transmission. Where buyers are going to be pleasantly surprised is with the smooth and linear accelerations, differentiating itself from other rugged and off-road worthy crossovers. While we'll take a deeper dive into the driving dynamics later in this video, there's a lot of confidence that comes with the CX-50, where its longer and wider dimensions don't hinder how this vehicle performs, and in fact reflects the nature of other Mazda products in the lineup. Coming standard is all-wheel drive, so you'll be able to tackle a wide variety of terrain and road conditions. And for fuel economy, you're looking at right around 23 miles per gallon in the city and 29 miles per gallon on the highway. During my time with the CX-50, my averages were consistently around the 25 miles per gallon mark, doing both back road and highway driving. Stepping inside, you're greeted by a familiar interior, but there's a few design aspects that will grab your attention and set the tone for the driving environment you'll be experiencing on a daily basis. The CX-50 comes equipped with power-adjustable, heated and ventilated leather seats, with both the driver and passenger sides having memory functionality for better convenience. As we begin to interact with this interior, you'll notice that the dashboard is more squared off and almost SUV-like to insinuate durability and ruggedness. That's reinforced by the hard-to-touch materials on the top portion of the dashboard, but as you glance further down, contrast stitching and soft-touch padding is very characteristic of current Mazda vehicles, but also provides a sense of luxury that you expect at this price point. From a technology perspective, you'll have an almost identical experience to the CX-5, as you have a digital display in between the analog gauges, showcasing a digital speedometer, fuel efficiency, and blind spot detection. As always for a top trim within the Mazda lineup, you will have a head-up display to help keep your eyes on the road ahead. Glancing over to the infotainment system, you'll have a 10.2-inch screen with wireless Apple CarPlay integration and Android Auto compatibility to go along with onboard navigation and the 12-speaker Bose surround sound system. As we've seen throughout the Mazda family, you'll have a rotary dial and quick access buttons to get you to different menus, and to make this brief, there's no real differences between this head unit and the one you'll use in the CX-5. However, one change that everyone has been demanding is touchscreen functionality, which is only possible when using Apple CarPlay, and this alone is a worthy upgrade, where you can scroll through apps and select your favorite music with a touch of a finger, as intended. By opting for the Turbo Premium Plus, you'll receive a 360-degree top view camera, along with front, side, and rear-facing cameras to help you park the CX-50, or even see what's on the path ahead of you if you're off-roading. Below, you'll find the buttons and dials for the dual-zone climate control, front and rear defrosters, and 3-level heated and ventilated seats. Then making our way back to the center console, the Drive Mode selector adds a new mode for the off-road, and not seen on the CX-5 is that each mode changes the color of the gauge cluster, which is a minor touch that will go a long way. Tucked out of sight is a wireless phone charging pad, and for the center storage compartment, there'll be enough room for smaller items. And rounding out the front seating area, and brand new for a Mazda, is a panoramic moonroof, which lets in a lot of natural light, but also makes the interior seem a bit bigger than the CX-5. Now before we check out the second row seating area for the CX-50, there's one thing I want to point out here about this vehicle. If you have any experience with the CX-5 or CX-30, you know that they're not the most easy to get in and out of, especially when it comes to the second row. But also, the CX-5 isn't the biggest vehicle, and neither is the CX-30, so legroom is definitely an issue. But one thing to help out with that, and really what's great since this crossover is longer than the CX-5, is that Mazda also designed these doors to open nice and wide. So you have easy access to the second row, so if you have any child seats, you can take them in and take them out. So I think the CX-50 is definitely more family friendly, but also it's easy to walk into this car and step out. So if they're children or even the grandparents, they're gonna have no problem getting in and out of this vehicle, and I'll demonstrate that. You can just walk right in, plenty of legroom, and then walk right out. And we don't really see that with the CX-5 or CX-30. So in that regard, this crossover right here, in my opinion, is family friendly. Now for passengers in the second row, we're gonna start off on the passenger side. And believe it or not, this seat is adjusted all the way back and somewhat on a recline. And I still have a few inches of legroom to work with here, amazingly. And the reason why I say amazingly is because Mazda rates the legroom very similar to the CX-5, and yet I don't remember the CX-5 having this amount of room when it comes to that legroom. And that's actually a really pleasant surprise, just because this vehicle, with its added length of around 5 inches, it's great to see that that really made its way for the interior rather than just looking a bit more sporty and rugged with a longer hood. Now, I think that if you're on the height of 5'8" or 5'9", you should be more than comfortable back here. Of course, for me at around 5'5", I'm pretty comfortable as well, but that's to be expected. But I think that if you have smaller kids, they should be not complaining when it comes to legroom or even shoulder room. Now, headroom, though, is really where it gets a bit interesting, because the CX-50 has a lower roofline than the CX-5. I think taller passengers may be hitting their head on the headliner, but average-sized adults should be more than fine. Now, moving on to the center seat, you are going to have a very aggressive center hump, and that's going to take away from legroom when it comes to the width. Now, surprisingly here is that the CX-50 is about 2 inches wider than the CX-5, and yet I still feel that this is not going to be perfect for 3 people back here. That if you want to squeeze a third person, it might get a bit claustrophobic, it might get a bit cramped. And that's why I feel that it still might be better for just having 2 people back here on the outboard seats. I'm just not feeling it with the center seat at all, just because even though you do have that extra 2 inches of width, I still think the shoulder room might be a bit of an issue there. But maybe on a short drive, you could squeeze in a third kid or a smaller adult. And then on the driver's side, this seat is adjusted as someone of my height, around 5'5". And of course, I have plenty of legroom back here. And I think that's one thing that Mazda really emphasized with this model, is to give you that legroom, give you that interior spacing, where when you are going on those road trips, when you are going off-road and you want to have those adventures, you can have your friends tag along. And I think that from that aspect, this crossover is pretty comfortable. Even though I'm going to say that the seats are firm and stiff, they still provide a good amount of support, and I think the seating position, best of all, is pretty great for this segment. Also back here on our model, we do have 2 rear air vents to go along with 3-level heated outboard seats, also 2 USB inputs. And rounding out the rear seating area, you do get a center armrest with 2 cup holders. Now coming around to the back, you're going to receive a power liftgate. And inside, behind the second row seats, you're looking at right around 31.5 cubic feet of room to work with, which is marginally better than the CX-5. Now, I've seen a number of videos trying to compare the CX-50 to the Honda CR-V and Toyota RAV4, but personally, I think the CX-50 is in a category of its own, similar to the Ford Bronco Sport and also the Subaru Outback Wilderness. It's not a traditional compact crossover and shouldn't be seen as such, and we'll talk about that during the test drive. Now, I was able to fit all my camera gear today and then some. So that's 2 bags of camera gear, a gimbal box, a box for my drone, and also a tripod. And I still had enough room for grocery shopping as well. So I think you'll be able to fit probably 5 to 6 bags of luggage if you are going on a road trip with the family. Then on either side of the rear cargo area, you will have some compartments for some smaller items such as water bottles or car detail equipment to keep this crossover looking nice and clean, but most likely it will be dirty most of the time. Also, you'll have quick release tabs to conveniently lower the second row seats, so that way you're spending more time loading this vehicle up with all your gear rather than physically lowering those second row seats. But speaking of the second row seats, once they are lowered, you'll have right around 53 cubic feet of room, which overall is actually less than the CX-5, but I'm not going to overreact to that because most likely this will be an adventure vehicle and you'll have friends and family tagging along with you. Also beneath the floor mat, you will have a spare tire, so that way if you do encounter a flat on your road trips or travels, you can fix that and be back on the road. And then finally, once you're done, just press the button and the liftgate will close automatically. So having driven the CX-50 around for over a day now, I am convinced that had Mazda not given this crossover the CX-50 badge, there would be no controversy whatsoever as to why this vehicle even exists in the first place. Because we can speculate what the future of the CX-5 is just because this happened with the CX-3. The CX-30 replaced it. And it only seems right that Mazda would create a lineup of the CX-30, CX-50, CX-70, CX-90. But they're very adamant in saying that the CX-5 is going to remain in place. And you have to wonder how they plan on doing this, because the CX-50 from the outside just looks like a more rugged version of the CX-5. And also, if the CX-50 is to replace the CX-5, it doesn't really make much sense as the direction that Mazda is going in, because Mazda's supposed to be luxurious, they're not supposed to be rugged. Well, when you get behind the wheel of this vehicle, that's where both crossovers diverge in direction. Because we can spend hours trying to find similarities, saying, oh, well, the interior is very similar, the technology is basically the same, and the exterior is just a more rugged CX-5. But the driving dynamics are far different. And what's interesting about this crossover is that it's supposed to be rugged, it's supposed to be off-road worthy, it's supposed to be durable, it's supposed to have that almost SUV-like feel, and yet it feels very much at home on the pavement. Now, right off the bat, where I think buyers are not going to choose a CX-50 over the CX-5 is really based on comfort. And suspension-wise, I'm not really noticing a lot of jolts. In fact, it's going over the bumps very well. It goes over the imperfections with ease, and I'm not getting thrown around. It feels very, very refined in here. However, and we talked about this very briefly with the hard touch plastics on the dashboard, that the seats are very firm and they're stiff. Now, they provide a good amount of support. They're very supportive seats, but they're not seats that are going to be plush. They're not seats that you would expect in a luxury car. The CX-5 has that. The CX-5 has more of a softer suspension. The CX-50 doesn't have that. Now, let's get on the highway here. Let's see what it's capable of doing. I have it in sport mode now. And what I love about this vehicle is that the performance and the acceleration is very linear. It's a very linear power band, and being on multiple highways in the Boston area, I've been able to get around slower drivers with ease. And that was one thing I was a bit concerned of, because it has the same powertrain as the CX-5, and it's a bigger crossover. I'm expecting this to feel a little slower and more lethargic, or as Kyrie Irving would say, docile. And it doesn't feel docile. It actually is a bit more engaging than the CX-5. And that's why I say that this isn't an either-or equation. This isn't where you're going to sit there and say, well, I'd rather have a CX-5 over a CX-50. No, you're the type of buyer that either wants the plusness or you want the more aggressive on-road demeanor where you're not going to have that softer suspension. You're going to feel the rigidity to this vehicle. It's going to go over the bumps a little differently than the CX-5, but that's perfectly okay for what this crossover has been designed for. And I think that's where Mazda has been able to find a right balance. Now, on paper, these two are exactly the same, but when you really get to know these crossovers well, you take it out for a test drive, spend a day with it, you notice the differences. They're not the same at all. I think a lot of that is mostly due to the fact that the CX-50 and CX-5 are not built on the same platform. Even though the CX-50 is supposed to be based off the CX-30, it doesn't feel like it. The interior layout would suggest that it is, that it's just a bigger version of the CX-30, but on-road demeanor is very different. Now, I really want to get into the road noise aspect of this crossover because that has been talked about quite a bit on YouTube and on the internet. And I have a few theories as to why that is, because you are going to hear some of that road noise, especially at highway speeds. And we all know the CX-5 is very well insulated, but the CX-50 is a little different, and I think there's a few reasons why. When it comes to road noise for the CX-50, it's a bit more audible than the CX-5. And really, I think that was done by design. Not necessarily that Mazda was intentionally trying to make a vehicle that seems less luxurious and less refined. But when you're trying to create a rugged crossover, there has to be some takeaways. There has to be some sacrifice. And I think, sadly, the road noise was part of that. Now, it's not egregious. I'm not going to say that you get a lot of road noise, but it's going to be noticeable compared to the CX-5. And I think when it comes to that, my theory here is that this window is not dual pane like the CX-5. So naturally, you're going to have more noise into the cabin. But it doesn't stop there. Part of it can also be due to the tire size as well. Now, this model is sitting on 20-inch wheels, which that alone can affect ride quality. But I gotta be honest, for a rugged crossover, I think this rides pretty well. Now, when it comes to the width of these tires, though, the CX-50 is sitting on wheels that are 245 width tires, whereas the CX-5 uses 225s. So that right there could be playing a role and could be the main culprit as to why there's a bit more road noise entering the cabin. But what I'm going to say here, though, is that it's not egregious, it's not crazy, but just to reach some answers here and to kind of help people looking at buying a CX-5 or CX-50, that there will be a bit more road noise. I think it's mostly because this doesn't have dual pane windows, but also it has wider tires as well. So keep all of that in mind. But compared to other rugged crossovers out there, like the Bronco Sport and also the Subaru Outback Wilderness and the Forester Wilderness, I think the CX-50 is actually one of the more quieter vehicles in its segment. Now, one thing I touched on very briefly with this head unit is that with Apple CarPlay, it functions as a touchscreen. And I can scroll through different menus, and even though I have to reach for it, I'm glad that I actually have that touchscreen functionality. However, one thing that has kind of ticked me off throughout my time with the CX-50 is that functionality disappears when the CX-50 is in motion. So right now, as we take this corner, and I'm going to reach for the screen, it's no longer working as a touchscreen. Now, I believe you can turn that off and on, but that's one thing that is kind of turning me off about the user interface. So they fixed that, but they're not giving that functionality at all times. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Yes, we have the touchscreen functionality for Apple CarPlay, but only when the CX-50 is not in motion. So now let's experience the back roads for the CX-50. And this right here is where I think I've had the most fun with this crossover, because even though the performance is not that bad at all, it's the handling I like the most. Now, I do have it in sport mode, but sport mode doesn't really change the driving dynamics at all. Doesn't change the handling, doesn't change the steering. It's still heavy, it's still weighted. Now, the engine does become a bit more peppy, a bit more responsive, but you're not really gonna notice much of a difference between normal and sport. But again, it just feels relatively planted on the roads. And you would think that with the higher ground clearance that it would have that body roll, that it wouldn't feel as connected to the road, and yet it feels pretty planted. It feels really nice. Now, when it comes to visibility, this is where you have to keep everything into perspective, because a crossover like this is not going to have the best visibility. Because we have a squared off hood, you can't see as much. Your peripheral vision isn't as good in this crossover as the CX-5. Because one thing I've noticed is that, one, you don't really have as much visibility looking out the front windshield, even though the A-pillars are not necessarily that bad. But on tighter roads, I'm a bit concerned that I'm getting too close to the yellow lines or I'm getting too close to the end of the road. And on roads like this, no problem, but my brain is telling me I'm driving a CX-5, but my eyes are telling me that this crossover is bigger. So the extra 2 inches of width definitely changes your perception of this crossover for sure. But part of me feels like that the CX-50 has a bit of a identity crisis, because it feels luxurious in here, but it has rugged qualities. And I think that's really where I'm a bit confused. That's the only part I'm confused about, because it feels too refined. It feels too well balanced to be an off-road vehicle. Comparing it to a Subaru Outback, just a regular Outback, or even an Outback Wilderness and a Ford Bronco Sport, it just feels more enjoyable to drive. Now, that could be because this has a 6-speed automatic transmission compared to the CVT in the Outback. And then also, I think that when it comes to the leather-wrapped steering wheel and some of the softer touch materials, it's a bit more upscale than the Bronco Sport. But getting back to the visibility though, looking out back, you'd have a smaller window, so you might not have the best visibility looking out back, but the rear headrests don't really get in my way. Then looking over to the side, the mirrors are actually placed very close to you. It's a bit of a learning curve there, because usually I expect the mirrors to be a little further out, closer to the A-pillar, and this is like almost right next to me. Now, I can see what's in my blind spots. In fact, I can see everything behind me. So from that aspect, I think it fixes the visibility issue, but the door panel is being sitting so high up, that is creating a bit of a blind spot when there are the yellow lines there, or even if there is a curb to my left. But the back road driving of this crossover, it's fun. I think it's more fun than the CX-5. And again, I think this is really where it comes down to your personal driving habits and what you want in a vehicle, because suspension-wise, it doesn't feel like a rugged crossover. It just doesn't. I've gone over bumps, I've gone over imperfections, and yeah, I feel the stiffness, but it doesn't ride like an SUV. It rides like a traditional crossover in that way. But I think because it has the extra ground clearance and the plastic cladding, it's definitely more capable. But really though, the steering is so on point, it provides a lot of feedback for a crossover. Again, I think it's more fun than the CX-5. And that's really where I'm having issues. That's where I don't know what Mazda really has planned in the future, because maybe this could be a replacement for the CX-5. I could see it, I could definitely see it, but at the same time, the CX-5 is drawing a whole different buyer, a whole different consumer, someone that wants the plushness and the comfort, whereas the driving dynamics are very different, but within its market, and compared to its rivals, its close rivals, it doesn't ride like an Outback Wilderness. It doesn't drive like a Bronco Sport. And I think that's where the CX-50 could very well be a very popular crossover, because it gives you the comfort that you want, even though the interior there's more hard touch plastics, but it at least rides somewhat nice for a vehicle that's considered rugged. So to wrap up this test drive and to answer your questions on whether the CX-50 is different than a CX-5, I'm going to say absolutely. The minute I was handed the keys to this crossover, I could immediately identify the differences. And it really started off with the weightness of the steering, but also the stiffness of the suspension, and also the firmness of the seats. Now, you're going to sit here and say that, well, it has a very similar interior to the CX-30. Doesn't drive like a CX-30, even though it's closely related. Doesn't really feel like it, and it definitely doesn't feel like a CX-5. Now, I think this crossover is designed for a particular buyer, but also someone who's never owned a CX-5 before, because this is really for somebody who is looking to purchase an Outback Wilderness or a Ford Bronco Sport. But my issue here, though, is I feel as though this crossover is experiencing an identity crisis, because it still feels upscale to me. Yeah, it's not as plush as a CX-5, but it has the characteristics and the personality of other Mazdas, where the seats do provide a good amount of support. I'm not really being thrown around at all when I go over the bumps or even when there are bends in the road. But also, even the lack of soft touch materials, it still doesn't change the fact that this crossover feels more premium than the Bronco Sport and Subaru Outback Wilderness. And dare I say it, this rides like every typical crossover in this price range and market. I think that's why you can cross-shop it with a Toyota RAV4 and Honda CR-V. I just don't think, though, that someone who wants to buy those two crossovers is going to find the CX-50 appealing. This is still for somebody who wants to have the off-road adventures, take on the dirt roads, take on the elements, but still be comfortable at the same time, still be a family-friendly option. And that's why I feel the CX-50 has done enough to differentiate it from the CX-5, but it's still going to give you the persona and personality of other Mazdas. And it's definitely reflective of the direction that Mazda is going in. And personally, I think that whether you find the CX-5 more enjoyable over the CX-50, or maybe you prefer the CX-50 over the CX-5, I think both are great options. So to wrap up this review, what are my final thoughts and takeaways for the 2023 Mazda CX-50? And do I believe that this is just a more rugged version of a CX-5? Well, I truly believe that this vehicle right here is for a completely different market and a completely different consumer. Because not only from the outside do you have more of this rugged and off-road worthy look, but then when you step inside, you have the same characteristics and tendencies, where you don't have the soft touch materials like you see in the CX-5. The CX-5 is a traditional compact crossover designed to go up against the RAV4, Honda CR-V, and Ford Escape. But the CX-50 is a vehicle that is an alternative to a Ford Bronco Sport or Subaru Outback or Forester Wilderness. And I think that's where the CX-50 really does a great job, because you get behind the wheel, you're not going to have that comfort. You're not going to have the plushness of the seats, and even the suspension isn't as forgiving as the CX-5. Also, what you're going to notice too is that the CX-50 has that completely different driving experience that we talked about during the test drive, where it feels a bit more heavy, it feels a bit more rigid, it has a stiffer suspension. And personally, and I've talked to a lot of people who work at Mazda, that they know that people who buy a CX-5 are not going to love the CX-50. But people who maybe don't find the CX-5 that appealing may love this vehicle right here. And really, I think what Mazda has done with the CX-50 is give you a vehicle that still looks like a traditional Mazda, but is rugged, yet premium. And that's one thing that we're lacking in this subsegment of vehicles of this size and in its market and price point. And I think the CX-50 slots into place perfectly, where it still feels a bit upscale, but it's rugged, off-road worthy, and adventurous. And we haven't seen that yet in this price point. And that's why I feel that the CX-50 is going to work very well side by side with the CX-5 and does enough to differentiate itself where it isn't a copy and paste, where there is no parity in the lineup like a lot of people are concerned about. I think this vehicle has done a great job of really setting itself apart. And it really just comes down to what your personal preference is. I don't think it's an either-or situation where, oh, I love the CX-5, but I hate the CX-50. I think really what it is that they're both great vehicles. It just comes down to what your driving style is and what you're really focused on in a daily commuter. If you want a vehicle that is off-road worthy and adventurous, you go with the CX-50. If you're just looking for a family hauler that is comfortable and really, I think, is a bit more upscale than its closest rivals, where you do have that soft touch materials and it feels premium for its price point, then I think the CX-5 would be the way to go. But I gotta be honest, I enjoyed my time with this vehicle, and the longer I drove it, the more I liked it. And I think a lot of you guys are gonna do the same, where a 5 to 10 minute test drive isn't gonna cut it. Once you experience it for like a day and you understand what this crossover is offering, I think that's where people are really going to enjoy this vehicle and understand why Mazda created a vehicle that is similar in size, but really sets itself apart when it comes to its personality. And really, I think Mazda has done a great job. I really truly believe that when you compare it to other rugged crossovers of its size in this market, I think the CX-50 has done quite enough to set itself apart from the competition. So guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more. Also make sure to follow me on Instagram at Boston Autoblog so you can see what I'm up to and what vehicles I'll be featuring in the future. And I will see you guys next time.